the Desert Sanctuary with Karl and Laura Forehand.
Often when we have doubts about religion, or we want to be contemplative, or simply ask questions, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert.
We would like to welcome you to our sanctuary, the Desert Sanctuary.
We've tried to pick guests that resonate with our fellow friends and seekers here in the desert.
Our hope is that you will find life for your body, soul, and spirit.
And now, here is our show. Before we get started with today's guests, let's check in with Karl and JD.
So, welcome back, JD. How are you?
Doing fine as always.
Yeah, your name once again in Taiwan is Jordan Fu? Didn't do that right, did I?
Yeah.
Sorry.
You're a little all over the place, but if you just do it with no tone, people will understand.
Okay.
My name is weird anyway. It's like it's not a real last name. They just did phonetic stuff. Fu is really a last name, but mine is actually the word for Buddhism, but without a person.
Oh, okay. So that's at least interesting, right? And something to tell your kids
it looks
about.
Weird, but it's a very auspicious name, which is what I found. I went onto an online name. I don't know what the word is. Luckiness determiner, and a very lucky name.
Yeah. So the Southern Baptist Convention is added again. I don't know if you've heard about that. That Rick Warren, was a real famous Southern Baptist preacher. He kind of called his churches different things. So it doesn't really reflect Southern Baptist, but he's one of the biggest churches. So they kind of treated him in high regard. Well, he ordained some women preachers, women pastors, and that's one of the big things. But the point a lot of people made right after this, they didn't do anything until he was gone. Like he had already retired, and then they came, to kick some churches out of the convention that had ordained women as pastors. Because that's a big deal. That's a huge thing for them. They can't get away from it at all, and they try to call it nice names, but they just don't want a woman preaching or being a pastor or having any authority within their hierarchy, which I don't necessarily agree with. But so people pointed out that just like a year ago or so came out this big report. Roger Moore from the Southern Baptist Convention resigned. The executive committee was covering up all these abuse situations, where they were victim shaming and ignoring and covering up all of these instances of youth pastors molesting kids, and then they just claimed, well, all the churches are autonomous, so we can't really do anything about them, but we can kick you out if you ordain a woman. If you let a woman speak. So the post I made was,
unless you put a woman in charge of men, then we certainly won't rest on our laurels.
Keep them silent. The SBC is.
I saw the.
Yeah. What?
Did you see the post about the speaking to that, the youth pastor that was like it was something about like him and his girlfriend have been together like 4 years, and she just turned 18 and he proposed to her. It's like some 35-year-old pastor and his like what was like 16-year-old girlfriend. It's like, geez.
Right. We have a lot of have a lot of stories come over the podcast about that kind of stuff. Especially in the Independent Baptist and Southern Baptist. But please don't.
Those will be the same people with signs out in front of a some sort of like LGBTQ event that are like, you fucking groomers, groomers. Now let me go home to my 16-year-old girlfriend. Yeah, 17 years my junior. It's like, okay. All right.
So drag queens have never molested children, but ironically, Southern Baptist youth pastors have, and we'll cover that up.
Well, they would prefer to call it acting historically, like in the Bible, where 40-year-old men would marry 13-year-old women.
That's right. Marry your brother's sister and so on. a lot of that craziness. But don't preach. Don't be a pastor.
Don't put. But well, yeah, women better not be preaching, and men better not be putting on dresses, because that is offensive.
Yeah. Mom and I watched RuPaul's Drag Race. I always want to say Drew Paul. It's very, very entertaining. It's tricky whether you call them men or women. It depends on whether they're in drag or not, and so on. But they're very, very talented. Like, even one of the things would frighten me, like singing. Well, they do singing, but they also have to do dancing. They also have to transform their face and the body, and all of that. And really just the tuck that would be traumatic enough. I mean, you know what the tuck is, right?
Yeah, that takes some bravery right there for sure.
Yeah, there's duct tape involved. Do you know that? Right?
I mean, that's no, I didn't know that, but that sounds painful. I can't. I feel like I would inadvertently give myself a Brazilian wax or something and never be brave enough to do it again.
Yeah, it's.
I also couldn't. I couldn't wake up every morning and paint a beautiful person's face over mine every day. It seems like a lot of work too.
That's right.
You're like a singer and a professional painter, and I
think that would scare me.
Too much work.
But I do respect them. Wow, what a deal they do. Anyway,
it's pretty impressive. I've been to, I think, one before it doesn't. I guess there's some in Taiwan. I guess I have been to like one in Taiwan, or one place in Taiwan that kind of does stuff like that too. But yeah, it's impressive.
What if a drag queen was a pastor?
What would be probably the most entertaining church ever.
Yeah, but what would the Southern Baptists do with that? I mean, they'd probably have to burn them at the stake.
Aneurysm.
Yeah, they'd have to burn them at the stake or something. Something dramatic to set an example. True. It's like a double whammy.
And now back to the Desert Sanctuary podcast with Karl and Laura Forehand. Hi, welcome to the Desert Sanctuary. I'm Laura Forehand. I'm so glad that you are joining us today for another amazing podcast. I'm here with Karl Forehand, and we have a wonderful guest, which we just met.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. Do you have anything to add before I jump into the bio?
Yeah, I tried to say this a little earlier and we had to stop the recording, but we've accumulated some YouTube videos. So we have probably 100 or so videos out there from different things. But now we're keeping all of the podcast episodes there because the services, they keep kind of 10 in their memory bank, and it's really hard to get past 10. And right now we're on a pace doing 2 a week. So we get to 10 really fast.
Right.
So if someone had a podcast and then they want to check back next month and share it with someone, it's a little bit hard to get to. So we have them out on YouTube now where you can get them instantly, also without searching or anything.
Yeah.
And just another avenue, another place to keep things. So like with everything, like, review, subscribe, do all of those things. But that's not really what we're here to talk about today. We're here with a guest.
Yes, we have Bruce Epperly with us today, and he has served as a university and seminary professor, university chaplain, and local church pastor. He is the author of over 70 books, including Process Theology, Embracing Adventure with God, The Elephant is Running, Process and Open and Relational Theology and Religious Pluralism, One World, Process Theology and the Lord's Prayer, and Prophetic Healing, Howard Thurman's Vision of Contemplative Activism. An ordained minister in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and United Church of Christ, he has taught at Georgetown University, Lancaster Theological Seminary, Wesley Theological Seminary, and Claremont School of Theology. Welcome to the Desert Sanctuary, Bruce. We're glad to have you with us today.
It's a delight to be with you, and I love the title, The Desert Sanctuary. I'm an early morning walker. I walk before sunrise, and oftentimes my ideas come then. And the other day, as I was walking through the townhouse neighborhood up above ours in Potomac, Maryland, somebody had a little placard on their door, said, "Sanctuary is everywhere." So the Desert Sanctuary is everywhere.
Yeah. We believe that.
So we kind of sit here, Laura and I kind of sit on the edge of organized religion, and we see people coming and going, and some of them, a lot of our audience would be quote unquote deconstructing.
Sure.
So a lot of them, in a very serious way. It's not something they sought out. They didn't say, what I think I'll do is go on this journey, outside of my religion or outside of my beliefs, but they were more or less dragged into it. They're there, and they're having to deconstruct. They're trying to make sense of their beliefs that they no longer hold. And so we see a lot of pain, a lot of trauma that's been induced by religion, sometimes by family, sometimes by cults. We, I don't know how we got connected. I suppose somehow through open and relational theology, process theology, those kind of things sound like.
I think it was your book, The Hotel.
Yeah.
And let me give a plug for that book to your audience. It was my airplane book. I flew out from coast to coast and read the first half of it coming to California from my home in D.C. area, and read the second half of it going back. And it's a page turner. So I commend it to your audience, as well as the other book on the Desert Sanctuary. They're both wonderful reads.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I was off work and just thought I wanted to write a novel. Didn't know if I had it in me, but I decided to write 1,000 pages a day. I heard it somewhere online. You write 1,000 pages a day. And the guy that was teaching that hand wrote 1,000 words a day. So I figured if I take a month and a half, and I'd have 45,000 words, and that'd be a small novel. But after, actually, I thought 60 days, 60,000 words, that would be even better. But then after 45 days, I had 72,000 words. So it became a novel. It was one of the funnest things I've ever done.
It begs a sequel.
Yeah, it just.
I mean, that's really one of my thoughts upon completing it. And I know you're interviewing me, but I'm just going to tell you my sense that it begs a sequel, because I really thought that there's more of a story in there. So just to plant that seed for future reference.
Yeah, yeah. So you've been a professor. You've written 70 books and all this stuff I'm reading. I'm familiar with Tom Oord and those people that talk a lot about open and relational theologies. I personally kind of follow those people, interact with them, but don't know a lot about open and relational theology. So you might have to fill us in as we go along if necessary.
Be delighted.
But looking back on your years, you've been around, I assume, at least as long as we have, maybe not. But,
well, I'm on the Medicare generation, so that probably does tell you something. I'm sure I'm older than both of you, so you look much younger than I do.
The first question is, how have during that time you've seen a lot of things, seen things come and go, but how have you personally evolved? A lot of people are deconstructing nowadays, and that means something different to different people. We tend to talk about evolution more than reconstructing and things like that. But how have you evolved in recent years?
Well, the thing that comes most to my mind is the term individuation, of bringing it all together. I'll tell you a little bit about my life and how that the process emerged. I'm the son of a Baptist pastor of a small town, Salinas Valley, California, Steinbeck country. And I probably was always my father's son. The story was, and my father was a post-World War II pastor, went to college and graduate school on the GI Bill and all of that. As a young man, he was a farmer, grew up on the farm. As a young man, he preached to the chickens, and he didn't enter the ministry till his close to 40. He was born in 1910, and he entered about 1950. I was my father's son. That is, I grew up with a sense of the presence of God. The song in the garden was very much my experience as a child. I come to the garden alone. He walks with me and talks to me. I had sort of those trailing clouds of glory, those mystical experiences that children have. And Jesus was real for me. We grew up in a Baptist church. My dad was the pastor there. It was an American Baptist church, but probably on the conservative side. I came upon some of my father's sermons after he passed away, and discovered that he was not doctrinal. He was probably theologically conservative, compared to me at least, but he was not doctrinal. And so I grew up in that nurturing kind of environment with my father. Having said that, that wasn't always the case in the church that he pastored. You know, there's often a dissonance between the pastor and the church, and I think you talk about that in the book the two of you wrote together. Mm-hmm. There's often a dissonance. My father was an experiential Christian, I think, more than anything. He had migrant workers stay in our garage. Even though he was an Eisenhower Republican, he had peace marchers walking from Los Angeles to San Francisco. I even remember one lad, Wes Oplinoff. He was probably 21 years old, who stayed in the church. He gave him a place to bunk out there. I remember as a child beginning to realize that the doctrines that I grew up with weren't adequate. And there were two particular experiences that struck me. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, my parents went to one of these Baptist meetings, church meetings that go on 2 or 3 days, and they left us with a pious Baptist lady, Mrs. Orr, and she had a poodle named Taffy, and I'd never had a dog, but I fell in love with this dog. And being very pious, I was a very pious child, I said, "Will Taffy go to heaven?" And Mrs. Orr looked at me like I'd either been flatulent on the one hand or broke the china, and said, "No, Jesus didn't die for the dogs. You better talk to your dad about that." And I felt at the time that there was something wrong with a religion in which God didn't love the things I loved. I didn't have words to describe it. But I felt almost a little bit of shame, that I had the idea that God loved dogs. A couple years later, coming home from Little League, I was walking home with my friend Richard Putsey. His father owned a bar in town, which is already a no-no for Baptists in those days. But we walked by our house, and Richard was a Catholic, and walked by the church, and I asked Richard, "Well, you want to come in? My dad will give us a ride home." And he said, "No, I can't come to church. Can't go into your church." This was 1961 or so, because it's a Protestant church, and it's a sin for me to go in there. And I felt the sort of dissonance that there's something wrong with religions that build walls and barriers. It really hit the fan, and this is shrouded in myth, by the way. And I know one of your interests is religious trauma. When I was about 11 years old, my father was asked to resign from his pastorate. The reasons were either political, theological, or behavioral. There's myths around all of those. Mm-hmm. And we were thrust out of this small town and moved to San Jose, California. And I literally took on the pain of the family. I got sick immediately and was sick for 2 or 3 weeks and was hallucinating and had a high fever. They could never diagnose what was wrong with me. And I suspect I was carrying the grief and the anger and the loss. I found out later on from my mother that my dad even was pondering suicide at that time. It was just such a terrible trauma for him. We went to the local church, was two blocks away. My dad's first job after leaving the church was a security guard in the burgeoning semiconductor industry in the Bay Area. And we walked down, my mom and brother and I, to this local non-instrumental Christian church. And I literally felt like I was going to suffocate every time I came into the building. I carried in my cells the pain of the family. Fortunately, I was able to personally rebound in this area. And for me, when you talk about deconstruction, the other word that I see that to describe it is that religion and faith is always about deconstruction. It's always about pushing the boundary and knocking down the barriers that either are so self-imposed or imposed by others. So what happened to me that's interesting, we moved up at just the right time, maybe. A few years later, it was the mid-'60s, late 60s. I began to read transcendentalists and Buddhists and Hindus and partook at full warp speed in the summer of love, in all that implies, spoken and unspoken. And when I was a first-year student in college, I grew up quickly in those days, and my parents had no language or concept to understand either me or my brother in those days. But I learned transcendental meditation at 18 years old as a first-year college student. Interesting enough, I started going back to church at a progressive Baptist church. Our two pastors were very progressive. One of them in the days before political correctness was called Shorty Collins, and he was called Shorty because he was 6'7". Shorty was at the heart of the anti-war movement and counseling draft conscientious objectors, of which later I became one. And John Aker was with the other pastor, and he was going through his own process of deconstruction at the time and looking for what he called an adequate theology. And we both discovered process theology at the same time. He took a class and audited one that I took in college at San Jose State. And he identified me as a professor and potential pastor. I was just a kid with long hair at the time. And that's all she wrote. Well, it was interesting because each of these steps required giving up something and opening to something. I learned TM, Transcendental Meditation, and then became interested in Christian mysticism. Later on, I encountered the New Age movement as a first-year teacher teaching death and dying and learning how people dealt with death and dying issues. And the New Age movement introduced me to a form of healing called Reiki Healing Touch. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. Yep. Later on, I became a Reiki master, and actually, this was some 30 years ago, and actually wrote the first book, to my knowledge, on Christianity and Reiki. Reiki introduced me to the healings of Jesus, which I take very seriously. I believe they did occur, though I don't believe they're supernatural. I believe the natural world is much more wonderful than we imagine. I keep meeting things that I studied Gandhi, and that introduced me to the Christian peacemakers and social activists. And I studied paganism and along the way, and that introduced me to the seasons and creation theology. As a matter of fact, in my last parish, and I did what every pastor should do as pastoral candidate. I had left seminary administration and was interviewing to be a pastor of a church on Cape Cod. And, at least among the United Church of Christ, where I belong now, and Disciples and United Church of Christ, nobody asks theological questions. And at the end of the interview, I said, "You haven't asked me any theological questions. And let me tell you, that it's important that you do so. So if you didn't ask me them, I'll tell you the questions. I'm a universalist. I believe that revelation is universal. I believe that Christianity is not the only path to salvation. I believe that survival after death is something that relates to all people. I don't believe in hell. And I said, if this is something that you can live with, then they could. Later on, I introduced seasonal worship in our church. Our church was right near the ocean. So we had our own sort of hybrid form of Christian equinox and Christian solstice services, with the point of reaching out to the spiritual but not religious people who'd never come to our church inside the walls. But so for me, I guess the deconstruction is sort of a transformation of getting rid of the things that block us from God. And I know that church, I suspect my dad's experience was very similar to yours, Karl's, in many ways, and yours, Laura, and my mom's, that the religion became too small for them. It became too picky. It became too narrow, too fixated on things that were abstractions and not the concrete experience of people like us, who feel pain and joy and happiness and doubt, and should be welcomed.
Yeah.
You mentioned this, the phrase you used was carrying grief.
Like in himself, that really hit
yourself. Me. Yeah, and I think Laura can attest to a large degree that's me. I do that. I think I'm an Enneagram 6, or at least I don't know. I can't ever figure that stuff out. But I'm very loyal. And
same here. I am too.
When we jump into groups, we love them unconditionally from the day one.
Yes.
And give your heart. You're loyal to them because you have good intentions. You want to help them. You want this group to work and so on. But a lot of us are like that, and we carry that grief too much. I don't know if that's the right phrase, but we carry it maybe too long.
Well, and that's the hard part, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I probably still have a bit in me from my childhood, and now it's been transferred into sort of a visceral response. I mean, when you're aware of this, you're not the prisoner of it. A visceral response toward a certain type of evangelical and Christian contemporary and conservative Christianity today that Donald Trump is our savior and Jesus is his prophet. On this day in which there's a speech in Waco, Texas, which is an interesting place to have a speech by anyone. But that whole authoritarian, looking for the powerful preacher, looking for the person to tell us what to do, that whole morphing of political leaders with God in ways that are utterly contrary to the spirit of Jesus. And I, have a visceral, I have to sort of hold myself back because I'm a very mild-mannered person and not a polemicist. I'm not somebody who looks for trouble. I don't write about things to hurt anyone or even to give anyone I try to avoid straightforward criticisms, but I just have a visceral response to that sort of faith, even today, as just being destructive.
So when you have that trauma, that grief that you're carrying, over the years, have you learned to effectively process that trauma?
I think for me it's been. If this applies even to both to my evangelical roots and to the Summer of Love experiences, when I went to graduate school, I put those all in the closet. Those weren't particularly traumatic. Being an evangelical kid wasn't traumatic when it was working, and the Summer of Love wasn't traumatic. But as I got older, I realized I had to take them out of the closet I had to because there was a positive energy about the evangelical faith. It's not doctrinal for me. I mean, in my 60s and now early 70s, I've recovered. Jesus is in recovery with me. You might say that my sense of a personal relationship with Jesus is very different than it was for 30 years or 40 years when I was the UCC Unitarians Considering Christ. And I think bringing that out of the closet, the psychedelic experiences that I had as not things I should be embarrassed about. And the same for trauma. I think that trauma for me really involved accepting my history. And it didn't happen entirely by accident. I had spiritual friends and had therapists and spiritual friends that helped me deal with the trauma of one event 30 years ago that still tapped into something. And we can't do it alone. Mm-hmm. And oddly enough, some of the best of the evangelical experience, and there's a lot of good in the evangelical experience. Problem with the evangelical experience is church. If people were just left with their experiences of Jesus, they'd be doing quite fine, thank you. Throwing yourself entirely on the grace of God, that doesn't have a doctrine attached to it. Mm. It doesn't say God's all powerful. It doesn't say anything about heaven and hell. It just says we can't do it on our own. That we need a presence that's more loving than we are and a power greater than our own. The dangers of all these movements is when they find their energy in abstractions. And the abstraction is the person going to hell. The abstraction is that terrible drag queen out there. Mm-hmm. I mean, how these people have become fixated on transgender people and drag queens just utterly amaze me. There's global climate change. And you're worried about some man with a dress. Well, I'm from Scots background. We wear kilts.
Right.
We've been wearing dresses for a hell of a long time. Nobody called us on that.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's accepting your history and accepting for all of it and having a trust that there's a providence that's working in your life to heal that.
Yeah.
A lot of prayer too.
Yeah. We've interviewed about 250 people on the Desert Sanctuary, and along with that, we met other people. Here's what I notice from that, and I know that's not exhaustive research or anything like that, but what we've noticed is those that are doing well, those that have progressed, they might have changed their beliefs, majorly, or they might have just changed a little. But what I've noticed the most about those people is they'll say something like this. They'll say, well, Karl, things really began to change when I went inside and when I learned to trust myself.
Yeah.
And can you comment on that with a lot more experience?
Well, yes. I think that's a big deal. And for me, it has a high spiritual value. Anything that comes from me, I'll be responsible for. I can't claim that God speaks to me as, I'm always worried when somebody says that. Mm-hmm. But I regularly ask for wisdom. I regularly ask for a greater wisdom, both from God, from Jesus, and from what the African religions have called good ancestors. It's not exactly the saints of the church, but it's the saints of my life. And almost when I'm writing something, and it's been kind of a tool for me as a writer, I'll oftentimes ask the people that were my mentors for wisdom to help me do this task. And they've never let me down, or whether or not they're giving me any wisdom, I don't know. I can't make that claim. Mm-hmm. But what I think it does is release the unconscious. I think it releases the inner wisdom that I have. And as a writer, as you well know, Karl and Laura, as writers, as authors, you have to to trust some sort of wisdom to put a book out there in the world, because once those words are out in the world, people can say, "Oh, you said that."
Mm-hmm.
And you have to believe, as I do, that anything I do is incomplete. Anything I do begs for something more. I don't ever think that we're finished. I've never written anything perfect yet. And I felt the things I published have all been pretty good, but I've never thought it was complete, perfect. And of course, when you discover the first typo on the second page of your book, you realize after it's in print with a typo, then I take consolation when I see it in a book by an author who's just sold 5 million copies, more than I have, which,
Yeah.
It's comments on how many I've sold, but
yeah. So we usually ask some kind of version of this question, but what are your practices now? I mean, sometimes here's what I want to say about that before you answer is I have found that some of the practices we have now in many ways are much simpler than I used to have, and they seem deeper. But a lot less required activity.
That's what I was going to say.
Certain things. But what have you found? What are your practices these days?
And that's really a wonderful question. And I'm one of these people that, once I learned transcendental meditation, I was sort of person who has a sort of natural rhythm to my life, or a sort of an order, There's a couple things I do, and then I'll talk a little moment or two about church stuff. I'm retired in a manner of speaking. People like us never retire as long as we have our wits with us. I'm still writing. I still get asked to teach classes and give seminars and things like that. And I say yes to the ones I want to. The only things I say no to are typically administrative tasks. If it involves, keeping an organization alive, I try to avoid that.
Yeah.
But I wake up in the morning. I would be fine at a monastery, which probably my wife isn't always happy about. But I wake up around 4:30 in the morning and do my morning meditation and write a little bit or read a little bit, take an hour walk, give myself a Reiki treatment sometime in the course of the day. Those are the sort of my mainstays: meditation, prayer, affirmations, Reiki, and writing and study. And I do them out of pure love. I don't have to do them, but they've kind of defined who I am. It's interesting. We've just moved back from Cape Cod to one of the Washington, D.C. suburbs, Potomac, which is really part of Bethesda, Maryland, and Potomac flowed into one another. They're both unincorporated suburbs. To continue to be with our son and his children. They had moved up to the Cape when we did. When they moved back 2 years ago, we moved back 2 years ago because we're very close to our grands. Probably the first year we were in town, I'd say we may have gone to church 1 out of every 4 Sundays. And it wasn't from any negative reason. There were just other things to do. And I didn't feel a tremendous loss. We started re-going to our current church, which we actually joined when I was university chaplain for Protestants at Georgetown. I started there in 1982. So we joined as members, even though I very seldom attended, in 1982. So we started back there. And we've been going pretty regularly, primarily to support the people in the church. Both of their pastors decided to resign this year. There's a certain void we have experienced to help out. And I always felt like I was at the sidelines. It's tough for a pastor or professor to feel home at a church. I just will be honest with that. It's tough to feel at home. And about 3 months ago, I finally felt, well, yeah, this is my church. and that I felt like it could have something offer to them. And it's an interesting form of deconstruction I'm trying to offer, not as the pastor, but as a layperson, although I may end up doing some bridge work till they find an interim. That's a potential thing. Mm-hmm. Is that progressive Christianity needs to be reconstructed. There needs to be a greater focus on spiritual practices. There needs to be we're all about doing stuff. Mm-hmm. We're all, and I'm interested in social action and interested in transformation and equality of all people. The need to recover a healthy Jesus. Mm. And spiritual practices, because many progressives, and this is okay, I don't judge anyone, know more about what they don't believe than what they do. Mm-hmm. And I think a living faith, even if it's just that there's an energy of love out there, even if there's a great mystery that lures me forward, mm-hmm. Some positive rather than a negative, I think, to propel us forward. You have to go through the negative, by the way. I mean, as a teenager, and I did this deconstruction pretty early in life, and maybe that was both a blessing and a curse. I realized I couldn't ever be in that church that I grew up with. I realized that wasn't for me anymore, and by the time I was a college student, I found a path that was a theological path that was helpful to me and that spoke to me. Living by what gives you energy, what gives you passion. That doesn't happen in a church, by the way. I mean, as I see, many people are starting their own base communities, their own, communities of friends that are friends of the Spirit, and that certainly suffices. I mean, I think the church has a certain role, and it may have the role of historically telling the story, mm-hmm. And hopefully it tells a good story. Mm-hmm. That's debatable, mind you. Right. Some of the stories are just downright wretched, mm-hmm. And downright hateful and downright destructive. And for me, as a progressive Christian, it's the sense of telling an alternative story that is our story, that doesn't have to be negative, but is passionate, positive, and widening of circles of care. Mm-hmm.
I kind of hooked onto a word that you said, just because it's been a word that, well, for a long time after we kind of left the church and everything, it was a word that was kind of traumatic. But I'm just curious, with your practices, what does prayer look like for you? Because when I hear the word prayer, I think, the Lord's Prayer, or we bow our head and we ask God for what we want, or we ask him to, spare us or heal us, or anyway. And those things can be a little bit triggering to me, because, Karl had a stroke. He's not going to be 100% healed. Yeah. We have a grandson who has many medical complexities. And, you hear a lot of people say, well, you never know, God can perform miracles. And I say all that because it's like, well, what is wrong with the way Karl is now? And what is wrong with our I don't see that there's any, just because they don't walk and talk like I do. Why do we need to pray for them to walk and talk like I do? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I think that, I don't think that prayer forces anybody's hand. I think that there are a couple different types of prayers that seem comfortable to me. Mm-hmm. One is just simply, as Anne Lamott would say, wow, thanks, help. Well,
I love her. Help. I love her. Yeah.
And And then what am I supposed to do here? Well, thanks, help, and serve. What am I supposed to do? I've recovered some things from my college years. I know that when I was a college student, before the big deal about WWJD, you all remember that. What would Jesus do? My one of my mentors, that shorty guy who was 6'7", In His Steps by Charles Seldom. So for me, sometimes prayer is just, what am I to do here? What's my calling here? It's intentionality. It's saying this is a glorious day. I will say my two prayers when I begin my walk. The first one is the Psalm, "This is the day God has made, and I'll rejoice and be glad in it." Just as a prayer of thanksgiving, and I have a sort of a litany for me. It's not necessarily for God. I'm sure God delights in such things, but God doesn't necessarily require me to do this. I do it for me, is to say, I'm thankful for waking up this morning. I'm thankful that I have a home and the bombs aren't falling around me. I'm thankful for the quiet of the morning before the work traffic. I'm thankful for the computer, and gratitude for life. The other is from the prayer that St. Francis didn't write, although it's grounded in Francis' thought, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Francis did create the spirit of that. I mean, I've become somewhat of a Franciscan scholar by accident. That's a whole other story, how that happened, by pure accident or providence, one of the two. That I'm going to enter every situation as a peacemaker rather than a destroyer. The temptation is to hurt people, and I want to bring love to everyone in my family and circle of friends. I will occasionally. There's other practice. Interestingly enough, it goes back to me being a young boy, growing up in the Salinas Valley, where I felt Jesus walking beside me. The Madeleine L'Engle, the author, I don't know if you know Madeleine L'Engle. She writes, look at her. She's written some wonderful things. She both wrote churchy things, but also science fiction, a swiftly moving planet, Wrinkle in Time. But she uses in her books a practice called kithing, which is imagining someone next to you and walking beside you. And then sometimes I imagine Jesus walking beside me like I did as that 5-year-old boy. Because now that I'm 70 years old, my mortality is before me. And I want to face my mortality with courage rather than fear. And for me, Jesus is a living reality, but not a doctrinal reality, if you can tell the difference. I could care less about... Even though I had a hell of a time, to be honest, when I was asked to write a introduction to Saint Bonaventure, and I had a heck of a time because I had to write about the Trinity, and I don't have a big relationship with the Trinity as such in any doctrinal way, but I have to rediscover the energy of Jesus, I guess, the energy of love. I pray for anything that anyone wants me to, and even occasionally have done the sinner's prayer with people as a progressive, just like this. Okay, do you believe in Jesus? Yes. Okay, you're saved. Don't worry about it anymore. No doctrine whatsoever. I mean, sometimes people come at you with just they need to hear the word of the grace in that very moment, and they need somebody to say, don't worry about it anymore.
Yeah, you're okay.
You don't have to worry about the doctrines. You don't have to worry about the church. God loves you. Get on with your life.
Yeah.
If you die tomorrow, well, something's going to happen and it'll be good. Either you'll be asleep. I don't usually tell them that. That could scare them. Or you'll be in heaven or something, but it'll be good.
Yeah. So I've heard you mention indirectly and directly contemplative things. Contemplative activism you mentioned earlier. And when you say Franciscan, I think of Richard Rohr and people like that. But I learned a lot of contemplative stuff from some Benedictine sisters.
Oh, yes.
And they taught me spiritual direction, focusing, biospiritual focusing, and things like that. The contemplative has been an important word for me, but I would say even a lot of people out in the deconstructing world and so on don't know that term. Can you explain what it means to be a contemplative? Or
I can sure try, and I want to reach back to what Laura said early on in your, because that was a very rich comment you made. I think contemplation, at the end of the day, is about simply noticing.
Mm.
It's simply noticing that in this, and I hope I have the mindfulness or the self-awareness to say that wherever I am, it's going to be okay. That all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of thing will be well. And I don't have to feel a deficiency now that I hold on to the handle when I go down the stairs, when once upon a time I ran down the stairs. I don't have to feel a deficiency that I have twinges in my knees when I'm doing my morning walk, which I didn't have 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And to know that it's okay. It's okay that wherever we are, we can be people of spirit, I think. Mm-hmm. For me, contemplation is noticing the wonder and beauty of the world in which we live and our connection with other people. Mm-hmm. It's not individualistic as much as saying that I'm connected with God, I'm connected with the universe, whatever term you want to use. I don't think God's particular. God doesn't have even damn isn't God's last name, but God's not particular about the names we call God. We can call God impersonal names like energy. We can call God personal names like Jesus. The divine will accept it anyway. I don't think the divine worries about those sort of things. I think that God gives us the path. I mean, what I've discovered, I guess, is that our personal paths are holy paths. And if we realize that, we have less to unlearn. I think that with my own grandchildren, as well as when I was pastoring churches, my mantra was to the children, God loves you, we love you, you could do something good in your life. Mm-hmm. End of story. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about any of the rest of yourself. You may have to unlearn some things you learned in church, but you won't unlearn things. You won't unlearn a lot of things that I had to unlearn, that others had to unlearn. Yeah. And I think contemplative is the beauty, wonder of connectedness, the beauty, wonder of this moment. This is the day God has made. I was just talking to that with one of my grandchildren this morning, who's there again staying with us for a few days while our son and his wife are off on an adventure. And I was reading something about the importance of just living today. Mm. And that he has choices. It's a 12-year-old, how he lives his life. I'm not, it's the job of grandparents in some ways to open the door that their parents may close a little bit. It's to be the non-judgmental, they don't have to achieve anything. You've been through the parenting already. You know that you'll make mistakes. Right. Yeah. You'll know somehow they'll survive your parenting. And that this day is sufficient. It's enough today to be alive. Mm. Mm. And it's a beautiful world if we take serious, if we just simply notice where we are. The mere fact of breathing and talking to you all and us seeing each other, how wonderful is that? Mm-hmm. How wonderful is that? And the billions of processes that allow us to be here together today.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. That's pretty cool.
That is. Yeah. So do you have any other questions? I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, I have one more.
Go.
I have one more. So
this is really good.
It's that last question, though. That's not your gotcha question, is it? Is it? Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not?
I usually ask the question, if you had a billboard that everybody could see, and I never tell people ahead of time, but so they appreciate that. But if you had a billboard that everybody could see, what would you put on your billboard? And the questions I sent to you says, what is your advice to the desert dwellers?
Okay.
What?
Those are two wonderful questions. The billboard question is might be stay awake, be aware, love more.
Mm.
Stay awake, be aware, love more. It's a beautiful world.
Mm-hmm.
And to the desert folk, I've, like yourselves, both of you have had long experiences of being asked for counsel, and I always try to look at when somebody comes to me to see the person in front of me, and realize that each counsel is unique. I had an interesting time when I was a university chaplain at Georgetown University. I had two students back to back that I gave spiritual direction to. This was now 30 years ago. One of them was sort of making an exit from Christianity. And I wasn't getting in her way, by the way. It was too paternalistic, too father-oriented, too male-dominated. And it was not my place to question that because I happen to believe she was right.
Mm-hmm.
The next hour was a Pentecostal student who came to the university from very narrow faith and wanted to know if she still was a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And my constant question to her, do you think, is Jesus important to you? And if she answered yes to that, I said, you don't have to worry about it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's telling you aren't. Mm-hmm. I'm not telling you aren't. If you believe Jesus is important, don't worry about what anybody else thinks. I think that to the people in the wilderness to know, I've often believed that statement. It came from the Quakers, but it was very much in the African American church. There is a way where there's no way. A way will be made. That being in the wilderness is sometimes the best place to be. We're going back to Tucson, Arizona next week for Holy Week, 3 generations of our family. My wife and I, right out of graduate school when I was finishing my dissertation, lived in Tucson from 79 and 80. And our only child was born in 1980 there in Tucson. So we're going back to the church that ordained us 40 some years ago. Mm. And the Saguaro Desert surrounds Tucson, and sometimes we're destroying the desert, but it surrounds the town. And it looks like there's no life there, but it's filled with abundance in the desert. Mm-hmm. A way will be made. There's fruit in the desert. There's life to be had. Mm-hmm. And I think it's that maybe God has brought you into the wilderness on the way to what will be your promised land. And your promised land is not the finishing of the story either. I think any time of faith settles its, I suppose that at this point in my life, there are a lot of things that I am willing to live by and I believe are true for me. But I don't ever want it to be final. I don't ever want to be quit learning. I don't want to ever quit growing. There's growth ahead. There's growth in the desert. The wilderness can be a place of beauty and wonder and life. And that's, I think, what I would share. And let them figure out what the fruit is. Let them figure out what kind of flowers and birds and creatures come forth. Some will be scary, but a lot of them will be wonderful and scary at the same time.
Yeah.
Wow. That was really good. And
we need that recorded. Because we get that question a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's with the desert metaphor? But that was excellent. And maybe I'll record it off and just play it for them next time.
Well, it's yours now.
This has been a really great conversation. And the thing I love the most about doing this podcast and just kind of the place where I'm at, I won't speak for Karl right now, is I do feel this connectedness with, the guests that we have on here. And I think there is some real powerful truth in that we are all somehow connected. But if people are wanting to connect with you, where can they find you?
Well, I'm a terrible website person. I do have a website. I don't even remember the address. It's in construction. One disappeared and one is emerging, but Facebook is fine. Facebook is fine. They can message me on Facebook. If they're not somebody who's telling me how good looking I am, and I get a few of those once in a while, and I'd like to get to know you better. I don't know if you get those.
Yeah, but he does.
I mean, I feel only a slight bit of oh boy, this is great, isn't it? Till I realize it's probably some bot somewhere. But just if somebody wants to introduce myself, I get those all the time, by the way, and I try to respond if I believe it's an authentic question. I think we're under obligation as writers, and people will find my email. They can, Dr. Bruce, I have a couple email addresses, but my business one is really Dr. Bruce Epperly @gmail.com. I still have the other old-fashioned one, but the Gmail I use for business for most of the time. For just I put it out on when I write a blog or something, or my lectionary commentary. And I think you're doing a great service here. I think that people need to know that both in your book on the wilderness, and tell me the name. I keep forgetting the name. What's the name? Tell me your name of your book.
It's called Out into the Desert.
That's right, Out into the Desert. Yeah. I think that's a really helpful book. What I liked a lot of things best about it, but I really liked the fact that it was co-written. I like the fact that Laura, your voice is significant in that book, because from the more conservative circles, the women's voice is not often present.
Right.
And for the active woman who's the wife or partner of a man who's a church leader, you're often have to toe the party line, and that can be I know my mom as a pastor's wife, I think, experienced some of those things. So when I read your part of the book, I said, I know my mother had some of that dissonance, that political nature of the work and how it's freeing to be out of it. And I think this podcast, and I hope it gets, I hope that people are hearing it, because people need to know that they're not alone in the journey.
Right.
And they need to know that the churches from which they've come are not the end of the trail. Because it does feel sometimes like you're adrift when you leave the institutions that you have nurtured you, and there is life out there. It might be another church. It might be a progressive church, like I found as a college student. It might be a group of friends. It might be simply finding a podcast that nurtures your spirit. You're doing a good work, and I want to applaud you, and I commend the book, because anyone can enter that book. Anyone can enter that book, and so it's been an honor to be with you.
Yeah. We appreciate your time so much today. This has been a very rich and fulfilling conversation for me. So yeah,
absolutely,
yeah.
Well, invite me back again sometime.
Well, for sure.
I've got all manner of tricks I can give. I like doing these, and I like doing these when I'm not entirely sure what the questions will be.
I don't want to get us off on a big subject right now, but one of the key words for me right now is listening. I've been a horrible listener throughout my life, and Laura's tried to train me better. But now I'm through doing some gene key work and some tarot and things like that. That word keeps coming out for me, listening. And I think when you do a podcast, if you do it right, the hosts are more than anything listening for 45 to 60 minutes. And we're listening, like the sisters taught me, to listen deeply.
Yes.
So that we're kind of like almost one. Those things are deeply impact you, deeply transform you.
Well, yes,
because we're connected, and so we could talk forever about that.
Well, and I'd be happy to listen.
Yeah, but for now, we're gonna close it out, and until next time, we wish you well. If you need anything from us, make sure and let us know, and we'll see you out there, and we'll be crossing paths.
Well, yes, and thank you so much. I hope we meet again. Time for me to cook dinner cook fajitas or something back home, or quesadillas tonight for the 1 grand that's still here tonight. So all right. Have a wonderful time. Thank you for having me. It's been a joy to be here, and it's been a joy. I profited from reading your books and the voices you have. So back at you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Listeners out there, we appreciate all your support. We appreciate the focus that's stayed on the book for, 6 months or so now, however long it's been out. We're excited about it. It went back up to regular price, but that's okay, and it's doing well. But we want to remind you, for those that are listening, we want to remind you to be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary.
Remember, all that wander in the desert are not lost. We hope that you know
you are seen,
you are heard,
and you are loved.